All right, applause. Great. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the National Constitution Center, and thank you for coming to today's town hall program. My name is Lana Ulrich. I'm in-house counsel here at the Constitution Center, and we are about to treat you to an exciting program. But before I introduce our guest, I just want to give a quick plug for some of our upcoming programs. Next week, we will welcome former White House advisor Cass Sunstein for a discussion on one of the more widely misunderstood constitutional processes, impeachment. We'll have Hank Meyer, author of a new biography on the mid-20th century Michigan Senator Arthur Vandenberg. And later this month, we will have the Atlantic's Franklin Foer for a talk on his new book, World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech, and leading thinkers including Jacob Heilbrunn of the National Interest and Sam Tannenhouse of the New York Times for a conversation on the future of American conservatism. Constitution Center members receive free tickets to our town hall programs and discounted tickets to our blockbuster evening programs and our continuing legal education credit offerings. And for more information on membership or on the upcoming schedule, please check out the membership table outside in the Kirby lobby. And now to introduce our guest speaker, a leading Civil War historian, Ed Ayers, is Tucker Boatwright Professor of the Humanities at the University of Richmond, where he's President Emeritus. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2013 by President Barack Obama and is currently serving as president of the Organization of American Historians for the 2017-2018 term. He joins us today to discuss his latest book, The Thin Light of Freedom, Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America, which is on sale today in our museum store. Please join me in welcoming Ed Ayers.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, guys.
So Ed, thank you so much for being here to discuss this great new book.
My pleasure.
Okay. So the book came out of a digital archive project, The Valley of the Shadow. Can you tell us a little bit about this project and how it led you to writing your previous book, In the Presence of Mine Enemies, and this book, The Thin Light of Freedom?
Yeah, we actually thought this up in 1991, and those of you who will remember, the World Wide Web didn't exist then. But the idea was, wouldn't it be great if we could share every piece of evidence about every person who lived in two communities in the Shenandoah Valley, Franklin County, Pennsylvania, Chambersburg, and Augusta County, Virginia, Stanton. And that instead of history being something that's just presented as a done deal to students and to people who like to read history, we could share the actual evidentiary record. Well, that seemed like a great idea. And it took us 14 years to do that because it turns out there is an enormous amount of material about 19th century America. So it's every letter, diary, newspaper article, census entry, military record, church record, tax record, Freedmen's Bureau record, all those kinds of things. But the idea was that I wouldn't be the only one to see all that evidence, that people could explore it for themselves. So you can see basically every source that I used for this book for yourself and see just exactly how wrong I was. It's been used many millions of times all around the world. Teachers use it for people to get a sense of where history comes from. It's not just that we make up stuff or it's our opinion, it's actually based on evidence. I have to admit, I often think of my mom, who was a fifth grade teacher, and I told her I want to go to graduate school in history, and she said, well, what for, honey? We already know what happened. And ever since then, I've been trying to show her, well, no, we don't. It's actually a lot more complicated than you think. So the Valley created the opportunity to write in the presence of my enemies in 2003, and then I became a dean, and then I became a president, and this whole time the Valley of the Shadow was sitting there just waiting for me to come back. And then last year I was able to spend a year exploring it again. The beautiful thing is it still works. And so I hope you'll explore it, The Valley of the Shadow.
Great. And so this book focuses on two counties, Augusta and Franklin counties,
Right.
and sort of a broad cast of characters. And so can you tell us who are some of your favorite characters in the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's better to be lucky than smart. And so it turns out that after I chose these two places because I knew they were centrally involved in the war, it turned out we discovered these remarkable records about people. It turns out that we have the only parallel diary of a husband and wife throughout the entire war from Franklin County Rachel and Samuel Cormany. Everybody who reads the book kind of falls in love with them. They're entirely appealing people who, from Canada, come back to Pennsylvania to help save the United States. And so Samuel is in the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Rachel's at home with her baby Cora and watching as big events sweep over them, like the invasion of Pennsylvania that comes the Battle of Gettysburg. And we're able to follow them on the home front and the battlefield throughout every step of the war. So I'm big fans of the Cormanys. There's also a guy, Joseph Waddell, who left a diary of his life in Stanton. He was a newspaper man, so he sees everything with the eyes of a reporter. But he has, well, actually, as it turns out, bad eyes. He can't fight, so he's home with 10 women, his wife and sister and other people, including enslaved people. And he writes down every day what it looks like. He's kind of skeptical. He admits before the war that he has doubts about slavery. He admits along the way that he has doubts about the Confederacy, and yet he's a staunch defender. So to see what that looks like behind the scenes. And then the other thing that I felt was so lucky for, The Valley of the Shadow, and thus this book, contains the largest single collection of letters from African-American soldiers who fought the United States colored troops. And they were misfiled in the county next door because the widow of the man who's one of the central characters and who's the sister of all the others, she remarries after the war, after he dies from wounds from Fort Wagner, and they're filed with her second husband in the next county over. New York Times did a story about the Valley of the Shadow back in 1999. This professor wrote and said, you would never find it, but you won't believe how great these letters are. So we have, you all remember the story of Glory. These men are with that unit at every step from drilling in Boston all the way up through marching back through the streets of Boston after the war. So I love all those people, but sometimes people just make cameos. They just have one quote, or they appear just a fleeting instance. There's one that I like, I don't know her name. A Union officer is in the Shenandoah Valley down near Augusta, and he notices a 75-year-old woman who is marching along with the Union Army, determined not to be left behind. And he says, she's walking for freedom, I suppose. So there's literally hundreds of people in there, and it was hard choosing just which vignettes capture them. So that was an unfair question, but we'll stop with that.
Great. So in the book, you discuss Gettysburg.
I do.
Where 50,000 men from both sides were killed. And so was this really the turning point in the war? And then also, I was wondering if you would like to talk about the story of John and Bowdoin, who is another character in the book, and his retreat with the wounded from Gettysburg.
Well, it seems a little insensitive to come from Virginia to Pennsylvania and say that Gettysburg was not the turning point of the war, but here I am doing that. We look back on it, and it seems that it was the pivot of the war, and both the white North and the white South agree that it was the pivot of the war because it ended up being exactly in the middle, as it turns out. But what that reminds us is as many men died after Gettysburg as died before. The war is certainly not determined by Gettysburg and even its coincidence with Vicksburg. So the book in general is telling us to forget whatever you know about the war, put yourself in the shoes of the people who were living it at the time, and you will realize that there are so many turning points. And that one thing I point out is that the war was impossible. The Civil War could not have happened. The things that happened in the Civil War were so deeply unlikely. So Gettysburg is very important. There's a reason that Volume 1 ends with Gettysburg and Volume 2 begins with it, so you get double your Gettysburg for the set. It is dramatically important, but in some ways it's important for what didn't happen. When this book begins, Lee has just come off big victories at Chancellorsville. He feels that he needs to get the armies out of Virginia. They're just ravaging the countryside. He also wants to demonstrate to the North that they cannot believe in Abraham Lincoln, that he cannot protect them, that they can just walk right in to Pennsylvania, this beautifully rich area, and there's nothing the Union Army can do to stop them. He writes his wife, Lee does, and says, what I really want to do is affect the election of next year. And so everything that's political is also military and vice versa. So what could have happened And what Lee expected to happen is that they would be able to stay in Pennsylvania for a long time, resupply their very hungry horses and men, ship massive amounts of the bounty of Pennsylvania back into Virginia, and maybe make it all the way to Philadelphia. Maybe make it to Harrisburg, is what they think they're going to be able to do. They did not plan on being able to stay such a short time and being driven away. So if you consider what might have happened and the consequences of that and didn't happen, Gettysburg is a turning point. If you consider what actually did happen, there was much hard fighting and much still up in the air after Gettysburg.
So you discussed the election of 1864, which you describe as the most critical in our history. And so can you talk a little bit about what were some of the issues in the election and why was the election so critical? And maybe just a little bit about the platforms of the Republicans and the Democrats.
I can. So what I argue is that the pivotal moment in the Civil War was the election of 1864. Many things were pointing toward that. Now, the Confederate States of America adopt the United States Constitution almost in whole, changing just a couple of things. One, a frank acknowledgement of slavery rather than the people held to service, and extending the term of the president to 6 years. And so Jefferson Davis never has to come up for re-election. But as soon as Lincoln is elected in 1860, he knows that he's going to come up again in 1864. And a lot of the war is pivots around that knowledge. So here's what we need to remember. After Gettysburg, after the Gettysburg Address, after Vicksburg, Lee does not think in the fall of 1864 that he's going to be reelected. Okay? Lincoln, in the fall of 1864, does not think he's going to be reelected. And the war is going so badly, especially in Virginia, but Sherman is still bottled up at the border of Tennessee and Georgia, that the United States has demanded so much of its people, and yet cannot seem to defeat this enemy that they outnumber and have so much more material than they do. And so the Democrats are vicious against Lincoln. I think when people read this book, and I know all of you will, it's a wonderful holiday gift, whatever holiday you may have. What you will see is that they are saying things harder about Abraham Lincoln than we can imagine. He's an imbecile. It's on his bloody hands that rest the deaths of your sons. Things like that that are very powerful. And so the Democrats are in a tough position because they don't want to argue, they don't want to pull against the United States, but they in some ways don't want the war to go too well because Lincoln will be reelected. So they are on a platform that says what we should be for is peace. How many of your sons are you willing to give? And do you really want to see the slaves freed? And do you really want them to flood into places like Pennsylvania? Do you really want that? Because that's not what we went to war for. We went to war to save the United States. And this Republican Party has turned it, perverted it into an anti-slavery war. This is what the Democrats are saying. Here's the remarkable thing. It's very close. The Democrats have their convention in Chicago. They're feeling great. And when they get back home, Sherman has taken Atlanta. And it's like, don't! You know, because it undercuts their whole argument of that the war is being lost and that they're going to have to negotiate with the Confederates. The Democrats don't say much about the future of slavery. You know, slavery has been deeply disruptive wherever the United States Army goes. But we need to remember, even as late as this, 3 million of the enslaved people of the South have never come within touch of the Union Army. Okay? The South is the size of continental Europe. And the United States, without all the paraphernalia that we have today, cannot penetrate a lot of those places. So it's not clear what the future of slavery might be. So after Sherman falls, things look a lot better. But Pennsylvania still hangs in the balance. And if Lincoln says, if I lose Pennsylvania, I might lose everything. The two largest states, New York and Pennsylvania, New York is going to go to the Democrats. But Pennsylvania could go to the Republicans. So I don't want to ruin the story, tell you how it turns out, but I would say this. Lincoln persuades almost nobody from the Democrats to vote for him in 1864 that he had not in 1860. nearly 48% of white Northern men will not vote for Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Isn't that amazing? In the greatest national crisis, with our greatest president, for the greatest purpose, that Northern Democrats will vote for George McClellan and the end of the war. 80,000 votes in critical areas going the other way would have not elected Abraham Lincoln. It's sort of a number that we may have heard in recent elections about the same percentage, but we understand now. But the Electoral College did what it was supposed to do. It gave Lincoln a great mandate. And so coming out of the election, there's no question that all the things the Republicans are pursuing. But what we need to remember, all through Reconstruction, that nearly half of white Northern men who wouldn't support Lincoln haven't changed their mind going into Reconstruction and so forth. So that's a crucial part of the story that we usually leave out. We're so eager to cheer on Grant and Lincoln, and to see the great outcome of the war that we know, that we forget how many white Northerners resisted it at every step of the way. Wow. Did I get all the different clauses of things that you'd asked me there? All right.
Yes, and so kind of relating to that, since Lincoln won this huge mandate but necessarily didn't have all popular support, he started to believe that a constitutional amendment was necessary, the 13th Amendment. So can you talk a little bit about what led Lincoln to this belief?
I can. I have reason to believe that people here might be interested in the Constitution, so let's talk about that. So Lincoln says that the election of 1864 is really the first popular referendum on emancipation. And it is, because everything that had happened to end slavery before then had been done by Lincoln himself as Commander-in-Chief, the Emancipation Proclamation, most importantly. So he realizes that if somebody like McClellan wins in the future, or if the courts challenge his authority to have ended slavery, if there's a different lineup on the courts, or if Congress decides that it's imperiled. So you will have remembered the great Lincoln movie, and I remember people being puzzled. Of all the things that you could show, why are we seeing this months after the war is almost over, and we're seeing Lincoln politicking? That's because what has to happen, if they don't get the 13th Amendment passed before the war ends, then these things are in jeopardy. So the end of slavery needs to be solidified. But he's got a lame duck Congress, and that's what a lot of the movie's about. Can he persuade these Democrats who've already been unelected but are going to still be there for another year to go ahead and side with the 13th Amendment? So, again, not to ruin the story, they do, and he's able to get it through narrowly. So people don't often realize that the 13th Amendment comes before the end of the Civil War. But it has to, or everything is imperiled.
So after the war ends, after Lee surrenders at Appomattox, the North is pretty ecstatic about victory until Lincoln is assassinated. And Johnson becomes president. Which is
not very long, of course.
Right, not long after. And so Johnson's president. What is the effect on post-war Reconstruction? The 13th Amendment's been passed, but Lincoln doesn't leave very specific instructions for what his vision for Reconstruction would have been.
Yeah, thanks for all the easy questions. I'd say that on that is that Lee's last public address, I keep saying Lee, Lincoln's last public address is about Reconstruction. And this is not a direct quote, but it's something like this: "I'll get back to you on the details." He says, "I will have more to say about this at some future date." And tragically, of course, he does not. But Lincoln does not lay out a plan for Reconstruction except to try to put the country back together as quickly as he can. And he had a plan for each state as soon as 10% of the population would declare the loyalty to the United States and come back into the country, they could. So Andrew Johnson believes that he is following Lincoln's plan, which is to help restore the country. Now, I want to be honest with you. I went to Andrew Johnson Elementary School in East Tennessee. I think there's only two in the country, one 35 miles away where he was from, and for some reason in the town where I grew up. And he's just universally despised. But here what we need to remember is that upon Lincoln's death, Democrats and Republicans said, well, at least thank goodness we've got Andrew Johnson. Because he was the great hero. He was the only Southern senator who refused not to go to the Confederacy. and then had been at great peril wartime governor of Tennessee. And had been obviously Lincoln's running mate. So Republicans had reason to think this is just what we're looking for. Here's a guy who understands the white South, but is committed to union and our success. But Johnson, unlike Lincoln, really did not value the freedom of the enslaved people. And he was willing to sacrifice them and their rights for the quickest reunification of the country that he could come up with. And in his mind, what that meant was, since you had almost all white men in the South support the Confederacy, even though they had been for union before the war, often vociferously so, a massive conversion to the Confederacy, that if we don't have those men, including those who fought against the United States, being put back into power, there's not going to be a base for a new Republican Party. So we're going to have to reach out to the good men of the South. I will pardon them. I take them at their word that they have acknowledged that they have lost, that slavery is over, and that secession will not be permitted. And then they come back into Congress. And the Republicans say, these are the men who were killing us just months ago, and now you're going to have them back determining our fundamental laws. That becomes the fundamental issue, is what will be done with the former Confederates? What are the consequences of rising up in rebellion against the United States? Whatever the pretext that you may have had, that it was your right as a state or whatever, the fact is that this has been what the Republicans called a rebellion. They should be punished. They should not only hold office, they should not vote. So the fundamental issues of Reconstruction are constitutional. It's that should people be allowed back in power who rose against the United States? So the Republicans say, absolutely not. There is no reason in the world that we should honor these men who have been traitorous. Instead, what we should do is to enfranchise the men, all men at this time, who have been held in slavery for 250 years. They're the ones that deserve political power. So when we were talking before about the unlikelihood of the things that happen, nowhere else after slavery's end was there such an expansion, such an experiment of the expansion of the rights of the formerly enslaved people. So you go from the Democrats who'd been Confederates thinking they had every expectation of running the South again, to instead the formerly enslaved people running things. So it's a huge switch in a very short period of time.
So despite Johnson's almost conciliatory approach to Reconstruction, how did the South respond still? It seems like you discussed in the book how there was a lot of resistance. There were institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau, but were they effective? And then how did this lead to the 14th Amendment?
I think that, so a couple of things I argue. One, if the South doesn't secede, there's no way that the largest and most powerful system of slavery in the modern world can end in 5 years. The only way that the United States could have had immediate, uncompensated emancipation was if the South seceded because of the Constitution. Lincoln says, I have no right to end slavery where it exists. Our plan is to stop the expansion of slavery. It will turn in upon itself and kill itself. And he said it should be gone in about 5 generations, about 1960. Okay? That's what the Constitution permitted. But the South, in great arrogance, really, said, we don't need the United States. We're the 4th richest economy in the world by ourselves. We are remarkably wealthy and successful. We will be our own country. We helped create this country. We helped write the Constitution. And we should not be hemmed in by a tyrannical northern majority. By risking everything, the South lost everything. And 4 million people held in slavery became free. Then the white South says, okay, we know that you had more men than we did and more stuff, and so you beat us. But that does not mean that we were wrong. and it does not mean that slavery was wrong. And they refuse to accept what the white North demands as an acknowledgement of the wrong that was slavery and that was secession. And the white South resists every effort to create rights and opportunities for the formerly enslaved population. So as a result, you have major massacres in New Orleans and in Memphis. You have smaller scale violence across the South, every county, every part of the South, and bitter resistance to things like the Freedmen's Bureau. And some of the most, you ask about my favorite characters, that's the white school teachers who come down from the North to basically risk their lives to teach the children and the adults who'd been held in slavery and illiteracy for so long. They are resisted. And the white South stands up and says, we will not tolerate black voting and the loss of our power. So this is where the radical Reconstruction comes in. I think, talking about this, the thing that I discovered that people comprehend least is that what we think of as Reconstruction starts 2 years after the war. Because we've seen Gone with the Wind, and it's like they're still there. That's Reconstruction. But in fact, it's 2 years. And during those 2 years, the white South does everything it can to resist the creation of black rights. So Congress says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have to write another amendment to the Constitution granting due process of law and granting citizenship to every person who is born in the United States, including the enslaved population. If you look back at the 14th Amendment, a lot of the language betrays the dates of its creation. It says, you have this unless you rose in rebellion against the United States. And it's like, well, that seems like a funny thing to say. Well, 2 years after, it's not. So in some ways, the white South creates secession, it creates emancipation, then the white South drives radical Reconstruction as well. It takes us back to those white Northern Democrats too, though. The Republicans realize that if they don't put these gains in the Constitution, that the next term, where the Democrats are in power, so much of what has been won in the Civil War could be taken away. And the 15th Amendment comes in the same way. So the 14th Amendment is not only the embodiment of these great American ideals. What do you think? The most important amendment? Do you accept that?
Probably.
Yeah, there we go. Right on the spot. See, it's not easy to be just ask questions out of the blue, is it? The most important one, but it doesn't just grow out of the innate goodness of the American people. It grows out of the profound challenge that was presented to them. That unless we enshrine this in the Constitution, there is no guarantee that the freedom and opportunity and rights that were won in this war will endure. And of course, as you know, it is nullified in many ways for another 100 years by segregation and disfranchisement. But the 14th Amendment is there when the great moral struggle of the Civil Rights Movement comes. They can draw on that. So without the 14th Amendment, we don't really have the completion of these great rights, even though at the time the white South was still able to steamroll over a large part of what the 14th Amendment specified.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of what it specified, we were talking a little bit earlier that the 14th Amendment even went beyond what Lincoln had kind of envisioned for the rights of the enslaved. Was that a result of what the South was doing during Reconstruction as well?
I mean, we don't know that Lincoln would have opposed the 14th Amendment, but at the time, there was simply not a plan for what the formerly enslaved people's lives would be. He said in that last speech that he could imagine that there would be some very intelligent black men, perhaps some of the 200,000 veterans who had fought for the United States, who would be enfranchised. That's all that he really announced that he would be. That led John Wilkes Booth, however, to say, this is going to be the trigger for my assassination. He just announced black men voting. So you could argue the 14th Amendment is the fulfillment of the direction that Lincoln was laying out, but I think it went farther than people imagined in 1865.
And so you mentioned that, throughout segregation in the Civil Rights era, the 14th Amendment continued to have relevance. And so kind of flashing forward to today, on your podcast, Backstory, which is great, I recommend everyone check it out. You recorded an episode discussing some of the more recent events that have been going on in Charlottesville with Confederate monuments and Confederate flags, and how can understanding the history of the era inform debates, contemporary debates about how to understand these monuments and kind of what to do about them?
Yeah, our show, our backstory, and it is awesome, check it out, is based in Charlottesville. And so we were there. I was going to teach a class at the University of Virginia that afternoon as a kind of an alternative to the things that were going on in the streets. And of course, that was canceled after the death of Heather Heyer. And we had to reflect on this, a pretty college town sort of engulfed in all this from a statue that had been built in the 1920s. So I live in Richmond, and I'm on the commission appointed by the mayor to think about what do we do with the largest collection of Confederate statues in the country, including Monument Avenue. So I've been listening to hundreds of people, different opinions about this. And when I go out, I'm not going to announce opinion right now because my job as a civil servant right now is to keep an open mind and listen to everyone. But what I'll say, whatever you say, I will argue with. So whatever position you believe, let me tell you what the alternative argument is. Here's what I think, is that it's necessary that we have this discussion. I don't see this as a dysfunction in some ways that we're talking about these statues. I think it's time that we talk about these statues and that we think about who put them up, when, for what purpose, what did they say when they put them up, what did other people say against them when they were put up, and how have they been sort of used in the public spaces of the country. So I think that in all the conversations that I have, people tend to want to skip over the Civil War itself. Often I hear that Robert E. Lee was a fine man, that he had been for the Union, he wasn't in favor of slavery, therefore the Civil War could not have been about slavery, and so forth. And to those people I say, let's think what would have happened had the South won. What if the men on the statues had won? Jackson and Stewart and Davis and Lee. You would have had the creation as a separate nation of the largest slaveholding country in the world that was at the pivot of the world economy, that had a monopoly over the single most valuable commodity in the world, and who had already announced that it thought it should expand into Cuba, maybe to Mexico, to Central America. What would world history have been would look like had the Confederacy won? Is a more useful way of thinking about it than to say what were the motives of the men and what were the character of them along the way. But then I find that other people don't really want to think about the hard journey of how it was that the rights and emancipation came about, and would wonder, well, maybe what we really should have would be statues to the 200,000 black men who fought, or for the 4 million people held in slavery, or that we should acknowledge that nearly half of white northern men wouldn't vote for Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Maybe we should be acknowledging the complications of our past rather than keep trying to simplify it. Statues just aren't very good at telling a complicated story. That's their whole point, is to tell a simple story. Here was a great man. And that's the problem. We're going to need to find other ways to explain this complicated story. Books are one way, podcasts, but also ways of different kinds of memorials. Why are the only memorials that we have for men on horseback? Think about the way we struggle to memorialize the Vietnam War and how powerful that statue is. One thing it feels to me is that we don't feel the gravity of this war as we should. We talk about Civil War buffs that kind of drain the suffering and drama out of this. One thing we need to remember is that if the Civil War occurred today and the same share of the population was killed, we would lose 8 million Americans. To give people some sense of what was at stake. So I think that we've tended to think of the Civil War as a white thing and emancipation as a black thing. We need to see they're the same thing. And that to understand one, we're going to have to understand both. So we need a new vocabulary. It's not so much about just moving the same pieces like a chess game around. We need to reimagine the central events in our history. So that's what I think, is that we're closer to the beginning of this conversation than we are to the end of it. And it's good for this country to think about how the most important thing that ever happened in this country, the end of slavery, actually happened and what it meant when it did. I see you have questions.
We do. We have some audience questions.
Okay.
And before we get to them, though, I want to ask just one last thing,
Sure.
kind of dovetailing off what you just said. You know, you're a historian. You host a podcast with historians. And so what do you think the role of historians is or should be in this discourse?
You know, what actually happened mattered. Now, that's somewhat of a naive interpretation, but I believe that there are, as in law, standards of proof based on evidence that actually matter. Knowing who said what and when, how they changed their minds, is actually important. So people who'd like to just skip all of that and say whatever they want to say about the Civil War, and I find this very often, that people often begin a sentence with, well, the Civil War was just about, and I said, you've already lost me. When you've got just, you know? If you think something as complicated as the Civil War, the end of slavery, is going to fit on a bumper sticker, you're mistaken. The Civil War is not just one thing. So I think that it is important that we actually look at the record that we have. It tells us a lot more than just unfounded opinion. So I believe more in history every day as I see that a history that is suppressed, that's silenced, doesn't actually go away. It just grows stronger when it comes back. Okay? It's better for us to be honest with ourselves, to acknowledge complications, to acknowledge shortcomings, rather than trying to make everything a monument that's only to our best selves or the selves that we wish we were. I mean this for the whole country. I mean this for all facets of our history. It's better to be honest with ourselves rather than to tell ourselves fairy tales.
Okay, so first audience question. If a constitutional amendment requires approval of state legislatures, how did it pass if the South was 100% opposed to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Did everybody hear that? Okay. So if a constitutional amendment requires the passage by the states, how were these amendments passed? Well, that was one thing. That 13th Amendment passes when the South's not in Congress, right? And the southern states that are under Union control. The 14th Amendment, this is what Reconstruction is. The Republicans say, okay, you former, and they always call it the so-called Confederacy. They never actually acknowledged the Confederacy existed. They said the so-called Confederacy. If you want to come back into the United States, here's what you have to do. You have to have elections to write new constitutions. In those elections, black men have to be able to vote. And black men have to be able to be elected as delegates to those constitutions. When you've come together and had a constitutional convention and write a new constitution that accepts the 14th Amendment, then you may come back into the United States. That is what unleashes enormous amounts of black political activism. They've been waiting all this time, mobilizing in their churches. White Southerners who have told themselves for 250 years that black people aren't capable of self-governance hear these eloquent speeches and watch voter turnout that would put us today to shame, and the bravery of going to the polls when your boss is telling you, if I see you in that line on Tuesday, you better not be at work on Wednesday. And despite that, they vote. And then they go to these conventions, and there too they are eloquent, and they write new constitutions, and then they are accepted. And this happens in over a couple of years, and that's how that happens. You know, in Virginia, they write the new constitution, and everybody, all the former Confederates know it's going to be a joke because there's 24 African-American men and some number of white Northerners who are there, and they know it's going to be a terrible constitution. And the most radical thing it does is create Virginia's first system of public education. And so they go, well, it's not so bad, but here's the fact. So that's 1868 and 69. By 1901, by the turn of the 20th century, every southern state has new constitutional conventions in which they basically nullify all the constitutions written during Reconstruction. And it's during those constitutional conventions from 1890 to 1908 in which things like the Grandfather Clause and the Understanding Clause and the poll tax and all those things are put in. So a constitutional convention endorses the 14th Amendment. Other constitutional conventions bypass it and actually make a travesty of it and the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment says you can't restrict somebody's voting on account of their color. So instead they do it through every other means that they can think of. And that's what hobbles the South for the next century. By the 1920s, voter turnout in Virginia is in the 20-something percent. Okay? So that white and black, the political system is hollowed out by this reaction to Reconstruction. So in many ways, the fight over Reconstruction takes 50 years to play out, and it looks for all the world as if the South has won. And then the Civil Rights Movement comes back and overturns that with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act.
To what extent was the Supreme Court involved in any of that and sort of upholding some of what the South was doing?
Yeah, the Supreme Court was not really very important to this. This is a deeply electoral process. I think one thing that surprised me when I really started thinking about the Civil War was how thoroughly electoral it was. Americans basically voted to have the Civil War, and then they vote to have Reconstruction. And when they don't vote that way, it ends. So almost immediately after Reconstruction is implemented, the Democrats start winning in the North, and it's undercut. So they start Reconstruction, but then the political power in favor of it begins to wane. And so that's why you don't find the Supreme Court or white Northerners basically doing anything to stop this reassertion of white Southern power after Reconstruction. The white South calls that redemption. They are redeeming the South from the sin of emancipation and Reconstruction. And the Supreme Court, people will know Plessy versus Ferguson about segregation, basically say local practice trumps these provisions. So the Supreme Court pretty much allows the white South to reassert its control.
How did the public narrative of the Civil War evolve between 1861 and 1865? And maybe kind of related to that in your book, you cite a lot of newspapers, local newspapers, and how did they kind of contribute to that narrative? Yeah,
I'm going to extend the question a little bit about the story. I mean, it's like we see today. I don't know about you, every time I look at my phone, it's like, okay, how's the story unfolding, right? What's the next installment? And so everybody has a story all the time that explains it. But if you change the end of the story, you've changed the beginning of it. So they keep going, yes, this is this wasn't the end, but it's coming soon. And when it was, we'll go back and we'll see the Civil War. There's Gettysburg right in the middle. It was the pivot around everything, right? So the story along the way is that the North is fighting for purposes entirely good, the restoration of the Union. But you'll notice that there's a fundamental problem there. If you restore the Union, you're restoring the Union with slavery in it. So how do you restore the Union and get rid of slavery? That's what Lincoln has to, the Democrats say, you're being hypocritical. You're doing something that's keeping the South from coming back to peace with us by attacking slavery. That's what the Democrats hate. But Lincoln has said there's not going to be a true reunion until we get rid of slavery. So that's the story. So the Democrats tell a very simple story. We went to war to reunify the country. The Republicans ruined it by turning it into a war against slavery. We hate the Republicans. We hate Abraham Lincoln. We resist this every bit. But the Republicans say, we have now seen that for a true reunification, slavery will have to be destroyed. And so the Republicans actually grow better before our eyes. They actually mobilize themselves to be the party that's in favor of freedom for all Americans and in favor of the 14th Amendment. And I think that what we see is that Abraham Lincoln's great, but unless he wins, it doesn't matter. And so it's the Republicans at every level who are mobilizing people who really couldn't have cared less about African Americans a few years before into now saying, yes, we believe that the country requires their rights for us to be truly redeemed. So the story is changing that way. What's interesting to see in light of the question about monuments and so forth is that memorialization begins as soon as the war is over. And the white South begins by singing songs and writing poems about Stonewall Jackson, and unlike Robert E. Lee, who's not. And children strewing graves on the flowers, on the graves, and celebrating the Confederacy as soon as the war's over. So they never go, we were wrong, it was a terrible mistake. Instead, they said we were overwhelmed, but we were not wrong. In those same towns, the black residents would march to the cemetery where the Union soldiers had fallen and put graves and American flags on their graves. So there was never a time when everybody just sort of said, hey, good game, it's all over with. When Lee dies, the Republican paper in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, says, we see newspapers around the country putting black borders around their papers and talking about what a great guy Robert E. Lee was, but we refuse. He betrayed his country. If he had stayed with the United States, the war would not have gone on for so long. And it's upon him that we place the blame for most of the deaths in the last winter of the war, that horrible winter of 64 and 65. If Lee had said to his compatriots, we have lost, we should surrender, your son might not be dead. And then they said, and this is most relevant for the current debates, for the 5 years after the war, he, with the right words, could have helped reconcile the white South to what had happened. Instead, he sat there silently. He's being praised for not saying much, but he should have said something. So their final conclusion is, we think that he should just be buried and his deeds along with his body. So, I think that, and then after that, the white North and the white South slowly begin to come back together, and the white North says, yeah, you fought a good war, you were wrong, but you're honorable, you're brave, you're good soldiers. And the white South says, we're actually glad slavery's gone, especially now that we're back in control of the black population. And they come together and celebrate their military struggles and forget about everything underneath. And that's why you can have all these statues in the South. It's like the North says, yeah, you lost the war, but you control home. You may put up these statues if you want to.
This is a question about Lee's counterpart, Grant. And so what was Grant's role in emancipation of slaves or the restoration of rights? How did Grant respond in Reconstruction? Obviously, he became president, and then in your book you also talk about it was Grant who recognized that his military victories were decisive to the election and to the outcome of the war.
Yeah. I don't know. Grant's undergone this great resurgence of reputation. And I was talking to some folks just 2 days ago who were from the North. They said when we were in school, everybody said that Grant was a drunkard and a butcher, and Robert E. Lee was a gentleman and a chivalric leader. And now those things seem to have been flipped. I think people look back and see that Grant and Lincoln won the Civil War. They were the team that could do that. I think it's true that Lincoln certainly knew that if the armies in the field didn't win, he was not going to win at home. Sherman obviously played a large role as well. After the war, Grant had not been known as a particularly political person, and if I'm not mistaken, had actually voted Democrat before the war. But Grant could see that so much of what had been won at such a cost would be wasted if Reconstruction were not seen through. The most important thing that Grant did was he launched investigations and resistance to the Ku Klux Klan, which emerges in 1870 and 71, especially in South Carolina. So Grant does what he can, but imagine, we talked today a lot about sort of guerrilla war. Imagine you have to fight every white Southerner all across the South with none of the power of surveillance, or radically declining numbers of soldiers who can't communicate. So pacifying the white South, we've seen how hard it is to pacify places in the modern world. Grant, I think, did what he could. And I think he is seen in Reconstruction as kind of coming in when the die had been cast in some ways.
In your book, rebel soldiers in the Valley are more considerate of civilians than Union soldiers. Do you think this was true throughout the nation? Or I guess, would you agree with that statement?
Well, I can see why people would say that. That's what Lee wanted the people of the world to believe, that we're going to come in to Pennsylvania, we're going to walk right up the Valley Turnpike, right into Chambersburg, and we're going to pay for everything that we take with our good Confederate money. And they have a printing press. And so they are actually making a great show of that. And they are making a show merely of taking everything that they want and need, not of destroying things. So that is the story that the Confederates want to tell. The next year, they come back into that same town of Chambersburg and burn it to the ground after demanding that they pay $100,000, which the leaders of Chambersburg thought the city fathers left with all the money. So the Confederates show up and say, "Pay us," and they say, "We can't. We don't have any money." And he says, "I'm sorry, my orders tell me to burn the town," and they do. And then the newspapers of the South say, "We wish the entire Susquehanna Valley were in flames." Okay, so the Confederate Army, and of course the first time they come in, the main thing they do is they round up every African American they can find, whether they were free or enslaved, and put them into slavery and ship them back down south. So that's a big exception. I do think that I think you watch over the course of the war, I don't believe there's a big difference between the way the Confederates and the Federal soldiers act towards civilians. You know, the thing is, there's all this burning, but by the standards of the 20th century, they consider women and children to be off bounds compared to anything that would happen as early as World War I with bombing. The Civil War is relatively constrained on that front.
In the part where you talk about Gettysburg, you mentioned the Gettysburg Address briefly, and this question's about what was Lincoln referring to when he cited 7 years ago? And then relatedly, you also mentioned when he was talking about a new birth of freedom, what did that mean to Lincoln, and what did whites at the time understand that to mean?
Yeah. These are good, hard questions. I feel like I'm at my PhD exam up here. You guys are asking tough questions. Well, 7 years ago, he's talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Lincoln would have said his entire purpose was to defend the Constitution. That was his whole argument for not allowing Fort Sumter to be taken. And there's been a lot written about the Gettysburg Address. And the thing to remember is, people say, well, why doesn't he ever mention slavery? Well, he mentions slavery in things that he writes before and after about all this. He's actually trying to, it's kind of an alchemy to bring together those two purposes of restoring the Union and of bringing together a broader kind of freedom. He recognizes that without the victory of the United States, there is no hope for any kind of freedom for black people and white people. So I think that Lincoln believes that the main thing he's doing is consecrating the lives of the men who died there and who were buried there. That it's a funeral oration, it's not a political speech. But he believes that the Union victory will actually bring to its true fruition of what was started in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That both of those documents were meant to point toward freedom, but had been pulled up short. Now they would have a chance to come to their true fruition.
Mm-hmm. Earlier you were talking about the process by which the 14th Amendment was ratified. And so this question asks whether making a ratification as a precondition for readmittance, how did this affect how people maybe everyday people interpreted the legitimacy of the amendments, and does that continue till today?
Yeah, I would say that white Southerners considered Reconstruction to be bayonet rule and considered these constitutions to be illegitimate, and that's why they overthrew them. You consider that Mississippi's is the first new constitution in 1890. That shows you how long there was between these things, right? 20 to 25 years. And during that entire time, they were basically being nullified through practice, if not by law. In Mississippi, when they come together to write this new constitution, they say we have to, because we cannot hand our sons responsibility for the state of Mississippi with a shotgun in their hands and a lie in their mouths. So we're going to have to change the Constitution so they don't have to bargain for or intimidate black votes. So in order to stop ourselves from behaving inappropriately, we're going to have to change the law of the land to do that. So, and they felt vindicated in basically overriding the 14th and 15th Amendments, but doing so by what they consider to be constitutional means.
Can we have time for 2 more questions?
Sure.
How is the Civil War perceived throughout the world, i.e. in Europe?
You know, I don't think it takes anything away from the greatness of the American nation to acknowledge that we might not be here if it weren't for the French who'd helped us in the Revolution. And so the Confederacy thought, you know, France and England really need us. We're fighting for the same rights of self-determination that are all over the world, that they are supporting in Greece and Poland, places like that. Maybe they should support us. And it's to a disconcerting extent, they might have, if the Confederacy had actually succeeded earlier in the war, and look especially at Antietam in '62, and made it appear that the Confederacy was a going concern. The main way that Europe saw this was as a disaster for suffering of the white population. They saw it as not a human rights, I'm trying to think what the word is, words that we use today. I've actually just used all the words in my head. I didn't know that was possible, but I think I've just done that. That it would be a crisis of suffering. And their goal was to try to end the war as soon as they can. So, but as the war proceeded, and the cartoons against Abraham Lincoln were brutal in London. But after it became clear that this was going to be a war that would end slavery and restore the United States, then people grew, especially after his death, to very much admire Abraham Lincoln. But the great Confederate hope all along had been, if we can do something like, say, win a battle in Pennsylvania, then we will be able to get the European nation behind us, and this war will come to a negotiated end, and the Confederacy will be allowed to exist, and we will have slavery, and the world will be restored to the way it should be.
Okay. So for the last question, there have been a couple about the monuments.
Okay.
And I know you don't want to take one particular stance. So I guess relating to what you've said about, how learning about the Civil War and, how we got here and where we are today can help inform the debate about the monuments. What do you think it says about where we are now that this debate has kind of been resurfacing recently? And does it suggest that maybe we need to, take a look at the Civil War, learn about it more? What do you think is going on?
Well, obviously, I think people should learn as much as they could about the Civil War. The monuments that we have in the South were put up in a time that I just described to you with these new constitutions, in which it was unquestioned about who ran things. And the monuments were a vindication of the earlier losses of so many of the men who had died fighting for what turned out to be a lost cause. And they were a celebration of those men and of the returned power of white people. Today, there is a greater equity in political power in the South and in the country. And it's not surprising to me that when African American people have a chance to reconsider the public landscape, they should say, why are there monuments to people who tried to perpetuate slavery and to separate from the United States? What are we supposed to tell our children when we see these big statues? It's not surprising that this conversation would come to the subject, nor is it bad. We should constantly be thinking about how do we represent ourselves, to our children, and to the world. And so it was very convenient for a long time just to ignore the statues, for them to allow them to fall silent. But I'd say in the many conversations that I have, a fundamental division is generational. Young people, whatever their ethnic background, just don't get why these statues should be there. Because they were not raised with any kind of veneration for Robert E. Lee, and actually not that much thinking, frankly, about Ulysses Grant either, right? It's like, what are these statues? Why would we allow these legacies from the past to be haunting our present? Other people say the statues are history, you can't erase them. What they really are is manifestations of not the Civil War themselves, but of a later period of history when they were revising their thinking about history. So what I think I'd like people to do is generally the answer to address historical problems is not less history, but more. To think about, why are these statues here? Who put them here? Did people resist them at the time? In Richmond, when the Robert E. Lee statue went up, the editor of the local black newspaper, who was on the city council, said this is a monument to treason. It's not as if people didn't think this all along. It's that now there's an empowerment where they can say this in the public sphere. So I think that it is not an accident that we're doing it now, because we live in a time where people are thinking about what does it mean to memorialize certain parts of the American past? That's why a place like the Constitution Center is so essential. To be able to come through and talk about not only to put up a monument to the founders and say, well, that was great, thanks a lot, but actually to talk about all the challenges that we still have every day. I see them as directly analogous. I would hope that we will find that we need a richer vocabulary to talk about all these things, that we'll think about new ways to connect with the past, that we'll recognize with all the means at our command that we don't just have to have bronze statues, but there are other ways, maybe even all the way back to a digital archive that lays out all these stories. There are new ways for us to think about the past, new ways for us to touch the past, and that's what we should be doing going forward.
Great.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.